On Christmas night, Richard and Lisa locked me out in the snow. I had only my purse. Through the doorway, Lisa sneered, "You cannot do anything on your own. You are desperate." Behind her, John pulled the curtain shut. The next morning, I handed a bank teller an old card my grandfather left me, hoping for gas money. She swiped it and went white. "Ma'am," she whispered, "please sit down. You need to see this. If this resonates, comment your city and the time you are listening." The truth changed everything. The bank manager's office smelled like stale coffee and nervous sweat. She turned her monitor toward me, her hands trembling slightly. Maintaining a steady expression, I simply stared at the screen, letting the reality of the numbers and legal jargon wash over me. For 12 years, I had been the invisible backbone of Richard's luxury architectural firm in Chicago. I designed the multi-million-dollar estates. I signed the blueprints that kept the company afloat. But my name was never on the door. It was always Richard's name, and now, John's. The card my grandfather gave me before he passed away 3 years ago was not a savings account. It was not a rainy day fund with a few $1,000s. It was the master access key to an irrevocable intellectual property trust. Reading the documents on the screen twice solidified the absolute certainty of my position. My grandfather had seen what Richard and Lisa were doing. He knew they were erasing me. So, he hired an independent legal team to register a corporate entity in my name. Every single signature blueprint I had created over the past 36 months was legally copyrighted under this trust. The firm did not own my designs. I did. Richard had no idea. Lisa had no idea. John, the 22-year-old newly appointed chief executive officer, definitely had no idea. They had just kicked out the sole owner of their most valuable assets. Requesting printed copies was my only immediate action. The manager handed over a thick stack of papers, still looking at me as if I had just won the lottery and survived a plane crash in the same hour. Gathering the files, I offered a brief nod of thanks and stepped out into the freezing Chicago wind. Sitting in my car for a long time, the broken heater barely registered. I felt a strange, quiet clarity, the kind of calm that only comes when you realize you hold all the cards. Lisa had called me desperate. She thought I would come crawling back, begging for my job, begging for a warm bed, begging for a crumb of their approval. That was their game. They broke you down so you would be grateful for the pieces they handed back. But the papers in my passenger seat changed the rules entirely. The firm had just secured a massive contract for a luxury resort. It was a project I had conceptualized, drafted, and perfected over 6 grueling months. John had taken credit for it. Richard had proudly handed him the reins to the company based on that very portfolio. They were selling a product they did not legally own, starting the engine. I navigated away from their sprawling estate. I drove to a quiet diner on the edge of town, ordered a black coffee, and opened my laptop. I had a lot of work to do. For the first time in my life, I was not building Richard's legacy. I was securing my own. The trust was ironclad. My grandfather had made sure that no one could ever touch it. The game was over. Lisa spent years telling our social circle a very specific narrative. She liked to paint me as the fragile, dependent daughter who needed her parents' charity just to survive. She told her friends that living in their house and working at the family firm was a massive favor they were doing for me. That was a complete fabrication. I was not living in their house because I had failed at life. I stayed because I was working 80-hour weeks to keep the company from collapsing under Richard's outdated management. I was the design director. I brought in the $7 million contracts. I spent my nights fixing the structural errors Richard overlooked and my weekends smoothing over the client relationships John nearly ruined. The real reason I was locked out in the snow had nothing to do with me being desperate. It had everything to do with James. James was 68 years old. He was the master carpenter who had built the custom woodwork for the firm's very first project. He was loyal, meticulous, and currently battling early-stage pancreatic cancer. He relied heavily on the company's comprehensive health insurance to afford his expensive treatments. 3 days before Christmas, John decided to assert his new authority as chief executive officer. He wanted to show Richard he could optimize costs, so he fired James. There was no severance package. There was no transition plan for his medical coverage. John simply called him into the glass office, handed him a cardboard box, and told him his role was redundant. Hearing the news, I refused to stay quiet. I marched into John's office and demanded he reinstate James immediately. John just leaned back in his expensive leather chair, smirking. He told me it was a business decision and that I was being too emotional. He said the firm could not afford to carry dead weight. Dead weight? James had given 40 years of his life to that company. Standing my ground, I told John exactly what I thought of his business acumen. I pointed out that his new marketing budget was double what it would cost to keep James on the payroll for another 5 years. Richard and Lisa heard the commotion. They did not ask what the argument was about. They did not care that a dying man had just lost his lifeline. They only cared that I was disrespecting the new head of the family. Lisa looked at me with absolute disgust. She said I was undermining John's authority. Richard told me I was ungrateful and jealous. That night at the holiday dinner, the tension boiled over. I refused to toast to John's success. I refused to smile for their perfect family photo. So, they told me to pack a bag and get out. They thought stripping me of my title and my home would teach me a lesson. They thought I would realize how small I was without their backing. Instead, they had handed me my freedom. James was going to be my first priority. Dialing his number. I listened as he answered on the second ring, his voice tired but warm. I told him not to worry about his medical bills. I had a plan. To understand how easily Richard and Lisa discarded me, you have to understand the glass ceiling built into the foundation of our family. I grew up watching Richard take credit for everything. When I was 22, fresh out of architecture school and brimming with ideas, I drafted a sustainable housing model that won a regional award. The certificate came in the mail with my name on it. Richard intercepted it, framed it, and hung it in the firm's lobby with a new plaque. It read, "A Vision" by Richard's architectural group. Questioning him about it only resulted in a patronizing pat on the shoulder. He said we were a team, and the family brand had to come first. Over the next 12 years, my signature slowly disappeared. I would spend 3 sleepless nights perfecting a cantilevered roof design for a luxury client in Aspen. Richard would take the final printout, literally cross out my initials in the corner with a red pen, and stamp the company logo over it. Then there was John. Amanda, my older sister, always treated John like a prince. From the moment he could walk, he was groomed to take over. It did not matter that his grades were mediocre. It did not matter that he spent his 4 years at a prestigious business school partying on a yacht paid for by my design commissions. John was the male heir. In Richard's archaic worldview, that was the only qualification that mattered. I was expected to be the quiet workhorse. I was supposed to lay the golden eggs while John collected the praise. They wrapped this exploitation in the noble guise of protecting the family legacy. "We do this for the name, Samantha," Lisa would say whenever I asked for a raise or a promotion. "Your brother and nephew need this stability." But sitting in that diner, looking at my trust documents, the illusion was shattered. There was no family legacy. There was only my talent, funding their delusions of grandeur. Checking the industry news on my laptop, the firm's latest press release popped up on my feed. John was announcing the groundbreaking of the Silver Lake Resort, the $7 million project I had designed. There was a rendering attached to the article. Zooming in on the image, something was glaringly wrong. John had altered the facade. In an attempt to leave his own mark on the project, he had changed the load-bearing columns in the main atrium to a cheaper, purely decorative material. He had no understanding of structural integrity. He was trying to cut costs to increase his inaugural profit margin, completely ignoring the engineering requirements. A cold realization washed over me. John was not just stealing my work, he was mangling it. He was about to present a structurally compromised design to one of the most ruthless luxury developers in the country. The developer did not tolerate incompetence. John had essentially handed me the match to burn their empire down. I did not need to sabotage them. I just needed to let John be himself. I closed the laptop. People often ask why someone stays in a toxic situation for 12 long years. They wonder why I did not just pack my bags, take my degree, and open my own firm at 25. It is a fair question, but it assumes that chains are always made of iron. My chains were made of guilt, obligation, and the desperate, lingering hope of a child waiting to be seen. When you grow up as the invisible daughter, you learn to equate your utility with your worth. Lisa was a master at cultivating this dynamic. She never explicitly told me I was unloved. Instead, she offered affection on a strict contingency basis. If I completed a massive project that brought the firm praise, she would invite me to sit next to her at dinner. If I asked for a weekend off to rest, she would sigh, look disappointed, and talk about how Amanda was always so helpful to the family. I became addicted to being useful. I convinced myself that if I just worked hard enough, if I brought in one more multi-million-dollar contract, Richard would finally look at me not as a tool, but as his equal. This is the invisible chain of the survivor. You learn to survive in the harsh environment they create, and eventually, the outside world starts to look terrifying. You convince yourself that the exploitation is actually a twisted form of love. You tell yourself that protecting the family is your grand purpose, even as they slowly bleed you dry. Every time I thought about leaving, a paralyzing fear would grip me. Who was I without the firm? Without my family's conditional approval, Lisa had spent 3 decades conditioning me to believe I was incapable of surviving on my own. You cannot do anything on your own. Samantha, her words from the porch echoed in my mind, but the sting was gone. The truth is, walking away from toxic family members is not a single, dramatic event. It is a slow, agonizing process of untangling your identity from their expectations. It requires grieving the parents you deserved but never actually had. Sitting in the diner, holding the legal proof of my independence, the fear had vanished entirely. The worst had already happened. They had thrown me out into the cold. And yet, I was still breathing. I was still whole. I had James's medical treatments to secure and a new empire to build. I was not the fragile creature Lisa had engineered me to be. I was the architect of their entire reality. My phone vibrated on the table. It was another text from Amanda demanding the login credentials for the firm's main server, complaining that John could not find the master files for the Silver Lake project. A year ago. I would have apologized and sent the passwords immediately. Instead, I simply deleted the message. The silence following my departure from the family estate was not peaceful. It was the heavy, pregnant silence that precedes a storm. Lisa's text messages demanding the server passwords had eventually stopped, only to be replaced by long, rambling voicemails from Richard, refusing to answer the phone. I sat at my small kitchen table, listening to the recorded audio play through the speaker. His tone was not apologetic. It was not even angry. It was dripping with a profound, terrifying entitlement. He spoke as if I had merely forgotten to take out the trash, rather than having my entire career stolen. He casually mentioned that John was struggling to find my old project files and that I needed to come over and organize them before the weekend. This is the normalization trap. It is the psychological mechanism that allows a family to exploit one of their own without losing a single night of sleep. Richard and Lisa suffered from a collective narcissistic injury. In their minds, my talent was not an individual achievement. It was a natural resource belonging exclusively to the family, much like a piece of land or a bank account. They truly believed that they owned my intellect because they had provided me with food and shelter growing up. To them, passing the chief executive officer title to John was the natural order of the universe. John was the male heir, He carried the family name. Therefore, any sacrifice required to elevate him was automatically justified. By walking away, I was not just quitting a toxic job. In their warped reality, I was committing treason against the bloodline. Abusers rarely see themselves as the villains of the story. They rewrite the narrative to frame themselves as generous martyrs dealing with an ungrateful child. Lisa genuinely believed she was doing me a massive favor by allowing me to ghostwrite the firm's success. She thought my silence over the past 12 years was submission. She never realized I was just observing, calculating, and waiting for the right moment. Listening to Richard sigh on the voicemail, complaining about how my absence was inconveniencing his golf schedule, a cold smile crept across my face. They were so deeply embedded in their own illusions of grandeur that they could not see the structural integrity of their empire was already collapsing. They thought they had amputated a weak limb. They did not realize they had just severed their own spine. Pouring my cold coffee down the sink, I packed my laptop into my bag. It was time to stop analyzing their pathology and start building my own future. Their reality was finally breaking. The smooth plastic of my grandfather's bank card felt solid in my palm as I stood on a quiet street corner in downtown Chicago. It didn't take long to transform that plastic into a physical, breathing space. I didn't want a grand marble lobby. I did not want massive brass letters spelling out my last name to intimidate clients. I wanted a sanctuary. Signing a lease for a modest, sunlit studio with exposed brick walls and massive industrial windows felt like drawing my first real breath. The space smelled of fresh paint and possibility. There were no ghosts of Richard's arrogant demands lingering in the corners. There were no echoes of Amanda's mocking laughter. There was only quiet, focused energy. My first official act as an independent architect was not drawing a blueprint. It was drafting an employment contract. Driving out to the suburbs, I parked in front of a small, neatly kept house. James was sitting on his front porch, wrapped in a thick blanket despite the mild weather. The cancer treatments were taking a toll, leaving him looking frail and exhausted. Walking up the steps, I handed him a thick manila folder. He looked confused, his hands shaking slightly as he opened it. Inside was a lifetime employment guarantee as the master consultant for my new studio. More importantly, it included a premium corporate health insurance plan, fully funded, effective immediately. James read the first page, and then he stopped. He took off his glasses and wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. He did not say a word, and neither did I. Resting my hand on his shoulder spoke volumes. We both knew what this meant. John had discarded him like a broken tool to save a few $1,000s. I was securing his life because his craftsmanship and loyalty were invaluable. The gratitude in James's eyes was the true foundation of my new empire. I was not building a company based on the toxic hierarchy of bloodlines and birthrights. I was building a chosen family, constructed strictly on mutual respect, integrity, and shared vision. Within a week, the studio was operational. 2 other senior drafters, who had quietly resigned from Richard's firm after experiencing John's chaotic management, reached out to me. I hired them on the spot. We set up our drafting tables in the sunlight. There was no yelling, no frantic deadlines created by incompetence, and no stolen credit. We simply sat down and began to work. My empire was quietly rising. Meanwhile, inside the glass walls of Richard's firm, the initial high of the holiday coup was rapidly evaporating into sheer panic. John was facing his very first real test as the new chief executive officer. A luxury real estate developer, one of the most ruthless and demanding clients in the industry, was expecting the preliminary concepts for a $7 million eco-resort. This was a client I had carefully cultivated for 2 entire years. They did not want standard, cookie-cutter designs. They expected visionary, sustainable architecture that integrated seamlessly with the natural landscape. John, whose deepest architectural insight involved picking out expensive Italian leather chairs for the boardroom, had absolutely nothing to present. He had spent his first 2 weeks in charge taking extended lunches and posing for a local business magazine profile. Now, the deadline was 24 hours away, and desperation was making him reckless. Incompetence often breeds a very specific kind of arrogance. Instead of admitting he was in over his head, John decided to take a shortcut. He ordered the firm's IT department to bypass the security on my old, locked desktop computer in the corner office. He dug through my archived folders until he found a hidden directory containing my unreleased, highly detailed conceptual sketches for the resort. These were not just rough drafts. They were my signature designs, complete with the complex structural calculations for a massive cantilevered roof system. They were brilliant, and they were entirely mine. John did not hesitate. He copied the files, stripped my digital watermarks using a basic software tool, and brazenly stamped his own name across the bottom right corner of every single page. He printed the portfolio on premium glossy paper and bound it in an expensive leather folder. He genuinely believed he was a genius. He thought business was simply about presenting a polished image and taking the credit. He assumed that because the drawings were sitting on a hard drive in a building owned by his grandfather, they belonged to him by right. He never stopped to consider the intricate legal web my grandfather had woven to protect those exact files. Adjusting his designer tie, John picked up the stolen portfolio and walked confidently out of his office, ready to secure the biggest contract of the year. He thought he was about to solidify his reign. He was walking into a trap. The luxury developer John was meeting was not just a wealthy businessman looking for a quick return on investment. He was a meticulous collector of architectural art. He had been quietly observing the output of Richard's firm for years, specifically tracking the anonymous, brilliant designs that always seemed to carry a distinct, invisible signature. He knew the specific way I angled light corridors to capture the morning sun. He understood my obsession with natural airflow and load-bearing timber. My architectural signature was as unique as a fingerprint to anyone who truly understood the craft. When John slid the glossy, leather-bound portfolio across the mahogany conference table, he wore a smug, victorious smile. He leaned back, waiting for the applause and the $7 million signature. The developer opened the folder. He looked at the first rendering. He did not praise John. He did not reach for his pen. He simply stared at the page, his eyes narrowing. He flipped to the structural schematics, tracing the lines of the cantilevered roof. Then, he looked up at the 22-year-old sitting across from him. He asked John a fundamental, basic question about the tensile stress distribution of the primary support beams. It was a question any first-year architecture student could answer, but it was essential to the specific design on the table. John froze. The color drained from his face. He stammered, throwing out a chaotic salad of meaningless buzzwords he had memorized in business school, hoping to distract the client. The developer closed the folder with a sharp, decisive snap. Standing up from the table, he knew immediately that Richard's firm was attempting to pass off stolen brilliance. He recognized my work, and he knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that the panicked boy in front of him had not drawn a single line of it. He told John the meeting was over. He refused to do business with frauds and amateurs. John tried to backpedal, offering discounts and making frantic excuses. But the developer simply walked out of the room, leaving the stolen prints on the table. The developer did not call Richard to complain. He did not waste his breath. Instead, he immediately tasked his private legal counsel with a singular mission. He wanted to find the true architect behind the curtain. He wanted to find the person who actually owned that structural signature. My phone was about to ring. The email from the developer's private attorney arrived discreetly in my new professional inbox just before noon. Within 24 hours, the developer himself was sitting on a minimalist sofa in my sunlit studio. He looked around the room, taking quiet note of the exposed brick, the focused drafters, and the complete absence of Richard's arrogant, gold-plated branding. Reaching into his briefcase, He placed a copy of the blueprints John had presented onto my desk. I did not act surprised. I did not raise my voice in anger or launch into a dramatic monologue about how my family had betrayed me. Smoothly opening my desk drawer, I pulled out my original, time-stamped files and laid them side by side with his copies. I then placed the certified documents from the Irrevocable Intellectual Property Trust right next to them. The match was flawless. The proof was absolute. Pressing a button on my desk phone, I summoned my intellectual property lawyer into the room. Ravines was a sharp, uncompromising woman who spoke strictly in the language of statutes, precedents, and federal compliance. I had retained her services the morning after I was locked out in the snow. Introducing Ravines to the developer kept the meeting entirely professional, stripped of all family melodrama. We did not discuss my mother's manipulation or my sister's cruelty. We discussed copyright infringement, commercial fraud, and the precise legal definition of intellectual property theft. The developer smiled, a genuine expression of respect. He did not just want to hire me. He wanted to ensure that the people who tried to insult his intelligence faced the consequences. He offered me the $7 million contract on the spot, completely bypassing Richard's firm. Signing the preliminary agreement with a steady hand secured my future. Ravines calmly gathered the documents. She outlined the next steps. We were not going to make an angry phone call to my father. We were not going to engage in a screaming match in their living room. Ravines was going to draft a formal notification of intellectual property theft, initiating a legal sequence that Richard and John could neither ignore nor manipulate. The machinery of justice was finally engaged. Everything from this point forward would be handled through notarized documents, certified mail, and absolute, devastating legal precision. The paper war had begun. To truly understand the trap John had walked into, you have to understand the rigid machinery of intellectual property law. Most people think of copyright as a vague, abstract concept. They think if you work for a company, the company automatically owns every idea that pops into your head. Richard certainly believed that. John banked his entire new career on it. They were both entirely wrong. 3 years ago, my grandfather and I sat down with a specialized attorney to draft an irrevocable intellectual property trust. The word irrevocable is the most important part of that sentence. It means that once the trust is established, it cannot be modified, amended, or terminated by anyone, not even the person who created it, without the permission of the beneficiary. I was the sole beneficiary. Every signature design, every unique structural calculation, and every custom aesthetic I developed was filed under that trust. Because I was never given the official title of a partner at Richard's firm, and because my employment contract lacked a standard work-for-hire intellectual property assignment clause, the firm had zero legal claim to my personal portfolio. When John took my cantilevered roof designs, erased my digital watermark, and presented them to a luxury developer as his own, he crossed a massive legal threshold. This was not a minor internal family dispute about taking credit. The eco-resort contract was valued at $7 million. In the eyes of the federal government, attempting to secure a multi-million-dollar financial agreement using stolen, copyrighted materials is not a misunderstanding. It is classified as commercial fraud. John had unknowingly escalated his petty arrogance into a felony-level offense. Ravines, my attorney, did not need to raise her voice to explain this. She simply drafted a meticulously cited notification of intellectual property theft, complete with timestamps, server logs, and the notarized trust documents. The paperwork was cold, objective, and absolutely lethal. It was a mathematical equation of ruin, and John had provided all the variables. If you love seeing karma delivered not with yelling, but with a stack of notarized documents, hit that like button right now. We sent the notice via certified mail directly to Richard's executive suite. I did not text them to warn them. I did not seek the satisfaction of hearing the panic in their voices. True power does not need to announce itself. It simply arrives, undeniable and absolute, leaving the guilty to drown in their own arrogance. Sitting in my new studio, I watched James carefully review a set of interior millwork plans. He looked healthier. The stress of medical debt finally lifted from his shoulders. Securing his future was worth every single calculated step of this legal war. My grandfather had given me the shield. John had willingly handed me the sword. Now, all I had to do was let the legal process run its natural, devastating course. The clock was ticking. The detonation inside Richard's firm happened precisely at 9 o'clock on a Tuesday morning. I know this because one of my former drafters, who was still stuck working out her notice period under John's chaotic management, texted me a single coffee cup emoji. That was our prearranged signal. Richard had just opened an email from the VIP developers legal team. It was not a request for revisions. It was a formal, immediate cancellation of the $7 million eco-resort project, explicitly citing copyright fraud and misrepresentation as the cause for termination. The fallout was instantaneous and catastrophic. Richard's firm had already advanced hundreds of thousands of dollars in preliminary site surveying and specialty material deposits, banking entirely on the initial payout from this specific developer. Without that cash flow, the company's operating accounts were immediately overdrawn. They were staring down the barrel of instant bankruptcy. According to my inside source, John completely lost his composure. He sprinted into Richard's office, his face pale and sweating, desperately trying to explain that it was just a misunderstanding over old files. He tried to blame the IT department. He tried to blame the developer for being unreasonable. But Richard, despite his towering arrogance, was not an idiot when it came to reading legal threats. He saw the attached documentation. He saw my name legally bound to the irrevocable intellectual property trust. He saw the timestamps proving John had actively stripped my watermarks. For 12 years, Richard and Lisa had comfortably assumed I was a dependent, fragile creature who needed their charity. They had built their entire superiority complex on the illusion that I was nothing without their prestigious last name. Now, sitting in an office that was bleeding money by the second, the horrifying reality finally set in. They did not hold my leash. I held their life support. Reviewing a new commercial contract when the front door of my studio chimed, I did not look up immediately. Taking my time finishing the sentence I was reading, I capped my pen, aligning it perfectly parallel to my notepad. I knew exactly who was standing in the reception area. The frantic, heavy footsteps echoing against the polished concrete floor could only belong to people whose entire world was collapsing. They had spent days ignoring my departure, assuming I was sitting in a cheap motel, crying over my lost family. Instead, they had walked into a high-end architectural studio humming with quiet efficiency. The walls were lined with breathtaking concept art. My new staff, including some of the best talent John had alienated, were working diligently at their drafting tables. The contrast between their failing, chaotic firm and my thriving, peaceful sanctuary was stark and immediate. The alarm bells had stopped ringing for me long ago. For them, the deafening noise of reality was just beginning. They were finally here. Richard, Lisa, and John stood in the center of my sunlit lobby, looking entirely out of place. They were dressed in their usual expensive designer clothes, Richard in his custom-tailored suit, Lisa draped in cashmere, but they carried the distinct, frantic energy of cornered animals. They were essentially well-dressed beggars, remaining seated behind my large oak desk, separated from them by a wall of soundproof glass. I watched them take in the space. Lisa's eyes darted nervously over the sleek, modern furniture and the framed, award-winning designs on the walls. She noticed James sitting comfortably in the corner lounge, reviewing material samples. He did not look like dead weight. He looked respected. Pressing a button to unlock the glass door, I allowed them to step into my office. "Samantha," Lisa started, her voice adopting that sickly sweet, motherly tone she always used when she needed a favor. She attempted to step forward to pull me into a hug. Raising a single hand, I signaled her to stop. I did not stand up. "Have a seat," I said, gesturing to the minimalist chairs opposite my desk. Lisa froze, her arms awkwardly dropping to her sides. She was not used to being commanded. Richard cleared his throat, trying to regain the authoritative patriarch persona that had controlled me for 3 decades. "We need to talk about this ridiculous legal stunt you are pulling," Richard demanded, though his voice lacked its usual booming confidence. "You are deliberately trying to sabotage your brother's first major project. This is family business. Samantha, we close the doors and we handle this internally." Meeting his gaze with a completely neutral expression, I refused to play his game. "There is no family business," I replied calmly. "There is your failing firm, and there is my registered intellectual property. The only thing we have to discuss is how John intends to avoid federal fraud charges." John, who had been hiding behind his parents, suddenly stepped forward, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "You did not hand over the files properly when you threw your little tantrum and quit," John shouted, pointing a shaking finger at me. "I just took what belonged to the company. You set me up. You purposefully left those blueprints there to trap me." I simply smiled. The delusion was staggering. The silence in my office was heavy, broken only by John's ragged, panicked breathing. He stood there, a 22-year-old boy wearing a chief executive officer title that was currently choking the life out of him, waiting for me to engage in his screaming match. I did not give him the satisfaction. "I did not set you up, John," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, forcing them all to lean in slightly to hear me. "I simply left. You chose to break into a secured server. You chose to erase my digital signature. You chose to present a $7 million structural design you do not understand to a developer who despises incompetence. You built your own trap. I just watched you walk into it." Richard slammed his hand down on the edge of my oak desk. "Enough of this nonsense," he barked. "I built that firm from the ground up. I spent 40 years establishing that legacy. You are going to sign a retroactive release form for those blueprints right now. We will smooth things over with the developer. John will take a step back, and you can have your old job back with a 10% raise." He said it as if he was offering me a profound, generous gift. He genuinely believed that a 10% raise would erase a lifetime of exploitation, disrespect, and the cruel, freezing Christmas night on their porch. Lisa chimed in, her eyes welling with strategic, manufactured tears. "Please, Samantha, think of the family. If this contract falls through, we will lose the building. We will lose everything. You cannot do this to your own flesh and blood. You are breaking your father's heart." Looking at Lisa, the memory of 12 years of late nights and stolen credit surfaced. I thought about James, packing his cardboard box while fighting cancer, because John wanted to look ruthless on a balance sheet. Rather than argue, I simply reached into the top drawer of my desk. I did not pull out a tissue for Lisa. I did not pull out a retroactive release form for Richard, extracting a thick, leather-bound folder. I slid it across the desk. Richard stared at the leather-bound folder sitting in the center of my desk as if it were a live explosive. He recognized the premium binding. It was the exact same type of folder John had used to present my stolen designs to the VIP developer just 48 hours ago. "What is this?" Richard asked, his voice suddenly hollow, unclasping the leather strap. I opened the folder so it faced them. Inside was a pristine, legally binding contract, printed on heavy stock paper. It was already signed, countersigned, and stamped by a public notary. "That," I said evenly, "is the finalized contract for the Silver Lake Eco Resort. The developer did not cancel the project. He merely relocated it to the architect who actually designed it. I have assumed full control of the $7 million development." Richard's face drained of all color. He looked like he had been physically struck. Lisa gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. John stumbled backward, hitting the glass wall of the office. "You stole our client," Richard whispered, the fight completely leaving his body. I protected my client. I corrected him. My grandfather taught me a very important lesson before he died. He said that a true legacy is not the gold lettering on the side of a building. A legacy is the integrity of the lines you draw. You kicked me out into the snow on Christmas, thinking you were taking everything from me. In reality, you handed me the entire kingdom. Richard slowly sank into the chair he had previously refused to sit in. His shoulders slumped, and for the first time in my entire life, he looked small. He looked like an old, defeated man who had finally realized that his empire was built on sand, and the tide had just rolled in. We are seconds away from the final checkmate. If you have ever waited for the truth to destroy a lie, comment "checkmate" below. Closing the leather folder, I pulled it back to my side of the desk. My attorney will be in contact regarding the civil damages for the unauthorized use of my intellectual property, I stated, my tone shifting to absolute business. The exit is behind you. Richard did not argue. Lisa did not cry. They silently turned and walked out of the glass doors, dragging John behind them. The glass door clicked shut. People like Richard and Lisa do not surrender gracefully. When their illusions of power are shattered, they do not reflect on their mistakes. They double down. They find someone else to blame, and they search desperately for a larger weapon. This time, the weapon was Amanda. Amanda had spent her entire life floating on the privileges provided by the firm. She had never designed a building, managed a client, or balanced a budget, but she felt entirely entitled to the wealth the company generated. Seeing her lifestyle threatened by the collapse of the eco-resort deal, she decided to step into the arena. She emptied her personal savings account and retained one of the most aggressive, notoriously ruthless corporate litigation firms in Chicago. They were known as shark attorneys, the kind who overwhelmed smaller studios with mountains of paperwork until they simply gave up out of financial exhaustion. 2 days after Richard and Lisa walked out of my office, a courier arrived at my front desk. He handed my receptionist a thick, heavily sealed envelope. Taking it into my office, I sliced it open. Inside was a formal cease and desist order, accompanied by a notice of intent to sue. The document was a masterpiece of legal fiction. Amanda's attorneys accused me of corporate espionage. They claimed that on the Christmas night I was forced out of the house. I had maliciously hacked into the firm's servers, stolen John's original blueprints, and subsequently poached their most valuable client. The demand was absolute. I was to immediately surrender the eco-resort contract and pay $10 million in punitive damages. $10 million. It was a fabricated number designed purely to cause panic. My phone vibrated on the desk. A text message flashed on the screen. It was from Lisa. "You brought this on yourself. Samantha, pack your things. Get ready to live on the street." She sent it assuming I was sitting in my office, hyperventilating, terrified of the massive legal letterhead. She wanted me to feel the same desperate helplessness she had cultivated in me since childhood. She thought the threat of financial ruin would finally force me to my knees. Looking at the text message, and then at the $10 million demand printed on heavy, expensive parchment, I felt nothing. I did not feel a single drop of fear. I did not feel angry. I felt incredibly, profoundly bored by their predictability. They were playing checkers while standing on a chessboard that I had built 3 years ago. We are seconds away from the final checkmate. If you have ever waited for the truth to destroy a lie, comment "checkmate" below. Dialing Ravinez's direct line. I listened to her answer immediately, the sound of typing echoing in the background of her office. I did not sound frantic. I simply told her that Amanda had decided to fund a $10 million intimidation tactic, reading the core accusations aloud to her over the phone. Ravines actually let out a rare, quiet laugh. She asked me to scan the documents and send them over. She promised to handle it before she took her lunch break. The sharks were swimming blindly into a concrete wall. I picked up my pen. Ravines did not spend days drafting a response. She did not engage in a prolonged, theatrical, back-and-forth legal negotiation. When dealing with absolute truth, brevity is your most lethal weapon. Exactly 1 hour and 45 minutes after I received the $10 million demand, Ravines sent a single email to the senior partner at the Shark law firm. The email contained a 3-sentence message acknowledging their claims. Attached to that email were exactly 2 digital files. The first file was the certified, notarized, irrevocable intellectual property trust, signed by my grandfather 36 months ago, clearly establishing my absolute ownership of the architectural signature. The second file was a certified IT server log, extracted by a third-party cybersecurity firm. It displayed John's exact IP address, logged in from his corner office, downloading my hidden files, and utilizing a basic software tool to scrub my watermark. The timestamp on John's download was precisely 24 hours before his catastrophic meeting with the developer. In the legal world, representing a client who knowingly provides forged documents to initiate a $10 million lawsuit is a quick way to lose your license to practice law. Amanda's expensive attorneys realized in a matter of seconds that they had been lied to. They realized they were being used as pawns in a federal commercial fraud case, and they wanted absolutely nothing to do with it. I did not have to wait long for the result. By 2 o'clock that afternoon, Ravines forwarded me a new email. It was a formal withdrawal notice from the Shark law firm. They were dropping Amanda, Richard, and John as clients, effective immediately. They officially retracted the cease and desist order and advised my family to seek independent criminal defense counsel. The $10 million threat evaporated into thin air, entirely dismantled by 2 pieces of paper. Amanda had drained her savings to buy a weapon, only to have it explode in her own hands. Lisa's gloating text message was now a digital monument to her own ignorance. And John was no longer just a failed chief executive officer. He was a primary suspect in a federal fraud investigation. There would be no more legal threats. There would be no more text messages demanding my submission. The paper war was over. We had fought on a battlefield of documentation, and they had arrived completely unarmed. Closing out of the email, I walked out of my office and poured myself a cup of tea. The studio around me was buzzing with creativity. Drafters were laughing over a sketch. James was pointing out a brilliant detail on a wood panel. The trap snapped completely shut. 3 months is a very short amount of time, but it is entirely sufficient to watch an empire crumble when the foundation is rotten. Without my architectural blueprints, Richard's firm had nothing left to sell. The cancellation of the eco-resort project sent a shockwave through the industry. Luxury developers talked to one another. Word spread rapidly that John had attempted to pass off stolen intellectual property. In the high-stakes world of elite real estate, trust is the only currency that matters. Once it is gone, it never returns. Clients began pulling their contracts. The revenue stream dried up completely. Richard tried to secure emergency loans to keep the payroll afloat, but the banks required collateral. Since the firm's most valuable assets, the design portfolios, were legally locked in my trust, the banks refused to lend them a single dollar. The internal collapse was even faster. The senior engineers and project managers, who had tolerated Richard's ego for years only because my designs guaranteed their bonuses, started packing their desks. The talent drain was absolute. Several of them reached out to my studio, and I hired the ones who possessed genuine integrity. John never returned to the office. The federal investigation into his commercial fraud resulted in a formal indictment. He was facing years of complex legal battles, hefty fines, and the permanent destruction of his professional reputation before his career had even begun. Amanda, having wasted her savings on a law firm that abandoned her in 2 hours, was forced to sell her luxury apartment and move back into the family estate. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, I had to drive across town to visit a job site. The route took me directly past Richard's corporate headquarters, pulling my car over to the side of the road. I parked and watched. A large commercial crane was stationed on the sidewalk. 2 workers in neon vests were unbolting the massive gold letters that spelled out Richard's name from the front of the building. The bank had officially foreclosed on the property. The building was being prepped for a liquidation auction. Rolling down my window, I listened to the metallic screech of the bolts coming loose. I watched the gold R swing heavily on a strap before being lowered to the pavement. I expected to feel a rush of vindication. I expected to feel the burning thrill of victory. Instead, I just felt a quiet, hollow peace. The ghost that had haunted my entire life was finally dead. The building was just concrete. When the assets of Richard's firm went up for public auction, I only placed a bid on one specific item. I did not want the expensive leather boardroom chairs. I did not want the high-end drafting tables. I bought the commercial woodshop, acquiring the entire facility. I upgraded the ventilation systems and purchased brand new, state-of-the-art machinery. Then, I handed the keys directly to James. James was officially in remission. The premium health insurance plan had covered the best oncologists in the city, and the absence of John's daily psychological abuse had allowed him to focus entirely on healing. He looked 10 years younger. His hands were steady, and his eyes were bright. I did not just want him to build custom furniture for my clients. I wanted him to build a legacy. We established a fully funded apprenticeship program within the woodshop. James was now teaching a dozen young, passionate carpenters from underprivileged neighborhoods the dying art of master craftsmanship. He was passing down his knowledge to people who respected him. My studio, meanwhile, had become a destination for the architectural elite. We were not churning out soulless, cookie-cutter mansions to satisfy a demanding patriarch. We were designing spaces that breathed, spaces that respected the environment and the people who lived inside them. Walking through the doors of my studio every morning, I no longer felt the crushing weight of obligation. I felt a profound sense of belonging. The people sitting at the desks were not my blood, but they were my family. We protected each other. We celebrated each other's brilliance without jealousy or theft. Lisa had told me I could not do anything on my own. She believed my value was entirely dependent on my proximity to their surname. She could not comprehend that a person's true worth is generated from within. I had walked out of their house on a freezing Christmas night with absolutely nothing but a purse on my shoulder. Now, I employed 40 brilliant people, managed millions of dollars in contracts, and provided health care for the man they had thrown away. I did not need their validation. I did not need their name on a plaque. I had built a kingdom out of the exact same talent they had tried to steal, and I had fortified it with undeniable truth. We built our own legacy. The email arrived on a quiet Sunday morning. It bypassed my professional filters and landed directly in my personal inbox. The sender was Richard. It was a long, rambling message, spanning nearly 4 paragraphs. He wrote about the pressure he had been under. He wrote about how John had misled him, and how Lisa's anxiety had caused her to say things she did not mean. He wrote that he missed his daughter. "We have lost everything." The final paragraph read, "But family is family. We should not let business destroy our blood. Let us meet for coffee. Let us start over. I am ready to forgive you." He was ready to forgive me. Even in the absolute ruins of his own making, his arrogance remained entirely intact. He still believed he was the judge, the jury, and the king offering clemency to a rebellious subject. He wanted me to return so he could attach himself to my success and pretend the destruction of his empire was just a minor misunderstanding. I did not feel a spike of anger. I did not feel the urge to type out a multi-page response detailing every single moment of pain he had caused me over 12 years. Forwarding the email to Ravines was my only response. I attached a one-line instruction: proceed with the final step. By Monday afternoon, a courier delivered a legally binding no-contact order to the family estate. It was a formal, chillingly polite document stating that any further attempts by Richard, Lisa, Amanda, or John to contact me personally or professionally would be met with immediate legal action for harassment. I did not block his email address. I simply ensured that the law stood between my peace and his toxicity. Family isn't defined by blood, it's defined by respect. And sometimes, the most profound act of self-love is letting toxic ties sever themselves. Looking out the massive industrial window of my studio, the Chicago skyline was bright, sharp, and clear. For the first time in my 34 years, the horizon belonged entirely to me. I took a deep breath, letting the quiet hum of my studio fill the silence. If Samantha's journey gave you the courage to set your own boundaries, share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Remember, your legacy is what you build, not what you endure. Subscribe for more, and I'll see you in the next one. I closed the laptop,